Vikings loved their kids, relying on their offspring to support them in their old age and carry on the family name. In Njal's saga, we see how Njal chooses to die rather than live without his sons, showing how deeply important children were to Viking families. Although, what was it like to be a child in the Viking era? Was it a carefree time of exploration and learning to fight and pillage, or did Viking children need to grow up before their time? Was it even a probability that they'd live to see their 10th birthday? Let's find out today. Welcome to the Viking Vault. High infant mortality. If we start at the very beginning, it's reasonable to say that the medieval period was not kind to little infants. The Viking Age and Viking countries were no exception to this rule, and children had a hard life. The life expectancy for an average Viking was only about 50, and that number was definitely brought down by the fact that many children didn't live beyond their first birthday. Historians have estimated that around 17% of the population of Viking Age York in England died before their 5th birthday, and a further 16% never reached 20. Birth was one of the most dangerous events in a woman's life, both for her and her child. Whilst we can't be absolutely certain what Vikings believed about the birth of a child, one tradition seems to indicate that the first week might be one of the most precarious times. After 9 nights on Earth, the child would be brought before their father and placed on his knee. He'd then sprinkle water on the child's head and announce their name. This delay between the child being born and then being named might show that Vikings were worried that the child would die, or it might serve a darker purpose. There is potentially evidence that children would be left outside, exposed to the elements, if they seemed sickly or if the family couldn't support another mouth to feed, particularly if they already had too many daughters. After those 9 days had passed, it would count as murder to leave the child outside. Children in the Sagas. It is unusual to hear about children in Viking Age sources, and they're pretty absent from the sagas too. This could be for a number of reasons. Perhaps it's because childhood basically didn't exist for Vikings. It's not to say that children didn't exist, but the idea of childhood being its own specific thing didn't necessarily occur to Viking Age people. Children today are seen as being different in a lot of ways to adults. We think of kids as innocent and vulnerable, and children experience life differently even from teenagers and young adults. For modern people then, children need to be protected and given minimal responsibility. On the other hand, Vikings saw childhood as a period of education and preparation for stepping into your full role in society as a Viking adult. It might also be because Viking children weren't old enough to be doing much of importance. Or alternatively, it could be because some Vikings had pretty horrendous attitudes towards children that weren't their own. Trust us when we say that being called child lover wasn't a good thing for a Viking. In the Icelandic Book of Settlement, one man called Olvir, who was described as a Norwegian man in good standing and great repute, came to Iceland with a band of fellow Vikings. As they landed, they seemed to have encountered some children and decided to play a bit of a game where they threw the children up in the air to catch them on the tips of their spears. It seems that this was too much for Olvir, who refused to take part, thus earning himself the moniker Child Lover. What his refusal to take part in this casual cruelty says about the difficulty of surviving as a child during the Viking Age, I'll leave up to you to decide. But it does seem to indicate a lack of compassion to children outside Viking society, although we must always take stories like this with a pinch of salt because it was likely written down centuries after Olvir was alive. It takes a village. Teaching and raising children in the Viking Age was a group effort. With extended family groups, the task of looking after the children would be passed among the older relatives, including grandparents, aunts and uncles, or even cousins who had the time to keep an eye on the younger ones and teach them what they needed to know. Education wasn't a structured activity in the Viking Age, and no one went to school. Few children were taught to read or write, shown by the fact that historians guess less than 20% of Vikings were literate. As such, Viking children would often learn what they needed by observing others in their household or by being apprenticed out to an expert. Young girls would have copied their mothers and older sisters as they learned how to organize their homes, and boys would have followed their fathers into working in the fields or fishing. Although Viking children spent most of their time learning practical skills so they could survive into adulthood, they did also spend time learning about the rich culture they lived in. During the evenings and dark winter nights, Vikings would pass the time by telling stories about their gods, their history, and reciting long heroic poems. This would have taught the children about important values, how to behave in society, and what traditions needed to be preserved and how. Child fostering. Some of the unusual practices that we see in the Icelandic sagas relating to children might also stem from this idea that you're not fully part of the family until you're 9 days old and been named and accepted by the patriarch. Other child-rearing practices of the time that seem unusual or even unkind to modern parents include child fostering, child exposure, and the rituals around childbirth. To go into foster care in the modern world is usually seen as a traumatic experience, and many parents try hard not to let it get to that point. However, Viking-age parents, especially the nobles, had a completely different attitude towards fostering, and often sent their sons to live in other families for extended periods of time. By sending their son to live with another family, they not only gave their son the chance to learn skills that they themselves might not possess, but also strengthened their hand politically. Fostering wasn't only a political move. At times, it seems as though it was almost a hostage situation where sons would be swapped to stave off any sort of intrafamilial conflict. Other times, the children grew up very close to their foster family and would retain that feeling of kinship throughout their lives. Buried with knives. Viking burials are eternally surprising, and one Danish burial is no exception. A mass burial site that dates to the Viking Age seems to indicate that, at least in this one place, many children were buried with knives. One of the fascinating facts is that most of the skeletons were aged between 4 and 8, indicating that young children were given sharpened blades. The reason that children being buried with knives is important, aside from the fact that we'd never give knives to little children these days, is the fact that these make up a part of the archaeological record known as grave goods. Grave goods are the objects that people were buried with, and often shows trends in fashion and religion, as well as showing what was important to these individuals when they were alive. This could be things to do with their job, or to show how important they were. For example, a warrior would often be buried with their weapons, and women often had their key belts and jewelry. With skeletons that can be 1,000 years old, it can be difficult to tell who this person was, what they did, or even whether they were male or female. As such, archaeologists have often had to rely on grave goods to tell them whether someone was important or not, or their gender. They still get things wrong though, as shown in the case of the Burka warrior, where a skeleton was identified as a high-ranking male warrior because it had been buried with weapons and high-value items, only to discover after that the bones belonged to a woman. In the case of these children, we can't say whether their knives were used in their daily lives or were added as part of a ceremonial ritual that is specific to the village they came from. However, we do know that these weren't toys. The archaeologist excavating the site discovered that the knives were made of steel and would have been razor sharp in life, and therefore incredibly dangerous when in the hands of infants. Child brides. When did you become an adult in the eyes of Vikings? It seems to have been different depending on what gender you were and whether you were married or not. According to the Icelandic laws, you were generally accepted to be an adult after your 16th winter had passed. If you were a girl though, you wouldn't be able to get the full benefits of womanhood like accessing your inheritance unless you were both 16 and married. It seems also that girls could have been married off as young as 12. It's not known for certain, but historians of the Viking era generally agree that the ideal age for a girl to get married would have been about 12 to 14 years old, or once they'd reached puberty. This isn't known for certain, but definitely happened at least once in the sagas. In Njall's saga, a man called Thrain Sigfusson goes to his nephew's wedding. While he's there, he sees and becomes obsessed with the bride's daughter, a 14-year-old girl called Thorgerd. Although Sigfusson is already married and much older than the girl, he can't tear his eyes from her and declares himself divorced from his wife. He then strides up to Thorgerd's family and asks for his hand in marriage, taking advantage of the ceremony to get hitched straight away. Although Thorgerd's family initially don't agree, there isn't a big fuss made about the girl's age, showing that getting married at 14 was not such an unusual thing. And once married, you were no longer a child. Viking Toys. Even if Vikings were considered to be grown adults much earlier than we do today, there is no denying that they would have had a fulfilling childhood. We have found evidence that Viking children had toys to play with. There is evidence of wooden toys from the Viking Age, including replica swords and ships, along with dolls and animals. While it's likely that these were made to be played with, these toys may have had a second purpose in training children to develop certain skills. A wooden spinning top would train a child's fingers to use a top, and wooden swords could be swapped for an iron ore when they're old enough. Even though play was important for Viking kids, it would have taken part in a separate physical space from the adults, as shown in both Eagle's Saga and Njall's Saga. In Eagle's Saga, it's made clear that children and adults don't play together, as they are separated out to play the game. Men against men, and children against children. In Njall's Saga, we get more evidence that children weren't central to Viking family life. Each time children are mentioned, they're on the floor and only talk to the adults when they're called over. Outro. So, life for Viking children could be hard. Adults didn't often pay them attention unless they were being taught practical skills for their adult lives. Many children succumbed to illness or bad weather, or even spears of other Viking warriors. They didn't go to school or learn to read and write, and had to grow up by the end of their 16th winter. Many girls were married at 14, often to much older men. But even with all that, Viking children survived and thrived. They were given freedom to play, but also had responsibilities to their wider family unit. They were told their histories and culture, learning what it meant to be a Viking, and how they could carry forward to the next generation. Thank you for watching this episode of the Viking Vault. Please do subscribe if you're enjoying the videos on this channel, as it's really going to help us out in these early days, and I'll see you next week for another video. Have a great week. Cheers!